Okay, so welcome to the third lecture in this four-part series on where are we headed? Perspectives on the second Trump presidency. Well, so much has been happening over the last few weeks. It's almost dizzying, but tonight we're going to focus on Trump and his relationship with the press. And if time allows, towards the end of the presentation, I'll talk a little about the United States' role in the ceasefire and where that might be headed. If there's not enough time at the end of this lecture, I will reserve that for the beginning of next week's lecture. But let's now talk about Trump and the press. In any democracy, a free press serves a critical role as a watchdog over government activities, and any effort to restrict that undermines democratic principles. Now, throughout American history, the media has traditionally served as a bulwark against abuses of power. It's also an engine for accountability. For example, the press played a major role in bringing the Watergate scandal to light. The press was also instrumental in exposing the Iran-Contra deal, just to cite two examples of the role of the press as a watchdog against the abuse of power. Now, most presidents complain, sometimes in private, sometimes in public, about media coverage of their administration, but they begrudgingly accept it as the cost of doing business, so to speak. Some presidents cultivated very friendly relations with reporters, and that often led to positive coverage, while other presidents had a more combative relationship with the press. Now, the First Amendment to the Constitution protects the press from government control. It's based on the assumption that democracy depends on a free press that serves, again, as a watchdog against government abuse. Yet, Donald Trump famously or infamously branded the mainstream media the enemy of the American people. Trump charged that the members of the press are, quote, among the most dishonest people on earth. Now, there is a natural built-in tension between presidents and newspaper reporters. Presidential administrations have always tried to feed the media in order to get the best exposure for its agenda. And the media often works to uncover the president's errors and transgressions to protect the nation from executive abuse or executive overreach. And so, as a result of all of that, friction between the press and the White House has really been a fixture of American politics since the very beginning, from the earliest broadsheets of the Revolutionary era to social media today. Now, the technology may change, but the mutual antagonisms between the press and the presidents remain. And as a result, every president has been dissatisfied with press coverage to one extent or another. So this presentation will explore the caustic and at times openly hostile relations between the press and specific presidents and how that tension might play out in the second Trump presidency. So we're going to go back into early American history. In fact, the battle between the press and the American presidency began with our first president, George Washington. Now, Washington was favorably inclined towards the printed word. He was convinced that a free press was vital to preserve liberty. And early on, the press refrained from criticizing Washington. George Washington was held in the highest regard by most Americans at the time. But the country soon divided along party lines, and early newspapers served as mouthpieces for either Washington's Federalist Party or Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. The National Gazette, that you see on the left, accused Washington of wanting to become a king. Now, Washington wasn't used to criticism, and so he canceled his subscription to the National Gazette. He also became the first president to rant against the unfairness of the press, or what we might call today fake news. One of the reasons why Washington decided to retire at the age of 64 was that he was sick of the criticism in the newspapers of his day. In 1796, Washington gave his farewell address, and in that speech, he included the following, which really was a scathing attack on the press. He said, "This address, fellow citizens, will be the last I shall make to you, as some of the gazettes of the United States have teemed with all the invective that disappointment, ignorance of the facts, and malicious falsehoods could invent, to misrepresent my politics and affections, to wound my reputation and feelings, and to weaken, if not entirely destroy, the confidence you have been pleased to repose in me." Now, this was in the draft of his farewell address, but Alexander Hamilton thought that this lament was too self-pitying, and so he convinced Washington to delete it from his farewell address. But I've included it to show you how Washington felt the sting and the animosity of the press during his presidency. Now, whereas Washington endured press attacks stoically, complaining about it to only a few intimates, our second president, John Adams, regarded press criticism as an outright threat to national security. He was determined to put an end to criticism in the press by signing the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which made it a federal crime to write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious criticism designed to place the government or its leaders into contempt or disrepute. Now, this is really an attack on the First Amendment, on freedom of the press. And so the Alien and Sedition Act is considered the most undemocratic law that Congress has ever passed. Now, that law expired in 1801 after Thomas Jefferson was elected our third president. Now, Jefferson said that liberty depended on a free press. He said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a great government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment for the latter." But while he preached the virtues of a free press, he acted very differently. Yes, he loved the press, but only if the newspapers loved him back. In truth, Jefferson was not any more tolerant of press criticism than Washington or Adams. And during his presidency, Jefferson became critical of what he regarded as the partisan nature of the press, and he began airing his grievances in personal letters. So, for example, in one letter he wrote, "Nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle." Harsh words. He was particularly upset with newspaper reports that he was having an affair with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, and that she had given birth to 5 of Jefferson's children. And Jefferson was not happy that that was reported in the newspapers. When he retired, he launched repeated tirades against the press. He claimed that the man who never looks into a newspaper is better informed than he who reads them, as much as he who knows nothing is nearer to the truth than he whose mind is filled with falsehoods and errors. Andrew Jackson, one of Trump's favorite presidents, was determined to win favor with the press. Jackson welcomed journalists into his drawing rooms and gave them high-level government positions. He hired other newspaper reporters as presidential advisors. Jackson helped to initiate an entirely new newspaper. It was called the Washington Globe, which became the official voice of his administration. In the 1832 campaign for re-election, copies of the Washington Globe were sent to every town where Jackson's men could distribute them. And with the help of the press, Jackson won re-election very easily. No other president before Jackson so well understood the power of the press, and few presidents ever controlled the news media to the extent that Jackson did. Now let's turn to Abraham Lincoln and his relationship with the press. Throughout his life, Lincoln was subjected to brutal attacks in newspapers, in magazines, and much of these attacks were personal. Editorial cartoons depicted him as an ape or a baboon. Now, Lincoln let most of these journalistic attacks roll off his back, but at other times, he fought back. And so, for example, he employed ghostwriters who placed articles in newspapers praising his administration's policy. That's the precursor of the modern-day press release. Lincoln used pseudonyms in newspaper editorials, attacking his opponents. During the Civil War, he launched an undeclared war against hostile domestic newspapers. Under Lincoln's administration, scores of editors were arrested. Unfavorable news was banned from telegraph wires. At other times, printing presses were seized and confiscated. Now, you might wonder, how could this be? Because all of this violates the First Amendment freedom of the press. But this was during the Civil War, and those civil liberties were suspended. Some newspapers were barred from post offices, so they could not be mailed. Certain correspondence were banned from the fields of battle. And Lincoln rewarded friendly editors with federal jobs. When the Chicago Times came out against the military draft, Lincoln ordered the newspaper to be shut down entirely. Now, some presidential scholars are critical of Lincoln's infringement on First Amendment press freedoms, but others agree that in an unprecedented case of rebellion, military necessity supersedes constitutional protections, including protections of freedom of the press. Now let's look at how some 20th century presidents related to the media. More than any of his predecessors, Teddy Roosevelt treated newspaper reporters as friends and allies. He courted the Washington press corps. He upgraded the shabby White House press room. He hosted informal press conferences with correspondents during his afternoon shave. It was known as the barber's hour. So while he was getting a shave, he would hold a press conference. Teddy Roosevelt originated the concept of political spin. He institutionalized the White House press corps by creating a press room and issuing press credentials. And he hired the first government press offices. But as with other presidents, Teddy Roosevelt had problems with the press. He expected his highly quotable remarks to remain off the record unless he said otherwise. Any writer who violated that rule would be banished from Roosevelt's inner circle. Any reporter guilty of leaks would be driven from the White House. Now, Woodrow Wilson was the first president to introduce official press conferences, although he did not relish meeting with journalists. Wilson acknowledged the importance of the press. He said, "The public man who fights newspapers won't be a public man for very long." Wilson would become angry when reporters would write about his family. And on more than one occasion, he threatened to punch newspaper reporters. Wilson held 168 press conferences in his first term in office. And in those press conferences, he frequently did combat with reporters, complaining about what we would today call fake news. He would snap at newspapermen, often lecturing to them. At one point, he even boasted that he no longer read the newspapers. After America's entry into World War I, Wilson questioned the patriotism of dissenting journalists, and he invoked national security concerns to censor the media. The Sedition Act of 1918 made it a crime to willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States. In other words, it made it a crime to criticize the government. Now, once again, this is a violation of freedom of the press. But as with Lincoln and the Civil War, the Sedition Act of 1918 was passed during World War I, when the civil liberties were suspended. Now, Ronald Reagan, as you probably know, was known as the great communicator. But before Reagan, there was another great communicator, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt understood that none of his programs would work unless the president continued to communicate effectively with the voters. And so to do that, FDR welcomed the press into his office twice a week. He held 998 press conferences during his 12 plus years in the White House. And his wife, Eleanor, did hundreds of press conferences on her own, promoting a variety of causes that were close to her heart. Now, there was a gentleman's agreement among the reporters never to publicize the full extent of Roosevelt's disability. As you know, he had polio and he could never walk on his own. But newspaper stories seldom, if ever, mentioned that the president was crippled. There were no photos taken of the braces on his legs or of FDR in a wheelchair. Reporters understood that there would be no pictures taken of the president being lifted into an automobile. And so those efforts to conceal FDR's infirmities was so successful that few Americans at the time realized that their president could not walk without assistance. But FDR's romance with reporters did not extend to newspaper publishers, most of whom aligned with the pro-business Republican Party. And so newspaper publishers took a dim view of Roosevelt's New Deal policies. And Roosevelt hated the publishers as much as they hated him. And so he said, "They are unanimous in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred." In each of his 4 presidential campaigns, FDR failed to win majority support of the nation's newspaper publishers. Now, Harry Truman, who had a reputation for plain speaking, had a feisty relationship with reporters. For example, after Truman's daughter gave a singing recital, the music critic of the Washington Post, a man by the name of Paul Hume, wrote that Margaret Truman, the daughter of the president, he wrote that Margaret Truman cannot sing very well. She is flat a good deal of the time. She cannot sing with anything approaching professional finish. Well, President Truman wrote the following to this newspaper critic. "It seems to me that you are a frustrated old man. I never met you, but if I do, you'll need a new nose and plenty of beefsteak and perhaps a supporter below." That was classic Harry Truman. Major newspaper publishers like William Randolph Hearst and McCormick Patterson, Scripps Howard, and Time Life, they were conservative and pro-business, and therefore opposed to Truman and his progressive agenda. And it was because of Truman's contentious relations with the press that Truman took great pleasure in displaying the headline of the Chicago Daily Tribune, which erroneously declared Thomas Dewey the victor in 1948, even before the results were final. And so you can look at the glee on Truman's face in this photograph. Richard Nixon waged a lifelong battle with the press. In 1962, he endured a crushing defeat in his run for governor of California, and he famously blamed the press. He asked newspapermen, "Just once, I would appreciate it if you would write what I say and not give me the shaft." Nixon claimed that the press delighted in his 1962 defeat for the governorship, and he gave a press conference in which he gave the following self-pitying comment: "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." Well, as we all know, that was rather premature because he would be elected president in 1968 and have many more press conferences. And when he ran for president in 1968, he used his hatred for journalists to his advantage, playing to those American voters who also mistrusted the mainstream press. But Nixon could never shake the sense that the press was against him. He once said, "Always remember, the men and women of the news media approach this as an adversary relationship. The time will come when they will run lies about you." And another time he said, "If we treat the press with a little more contempt, we'll probably get better treatment." In December of 1972, he told Henry Kissinger, "Never forget, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. Write that on the blackboard 100 times." And he once told the Joint Chiefs of Staff, "The press is your enemy." Enemies, understand that? Because they're trying to stick the knife right into our groin. Among those on Nixon's enemies list were numerous journalists and broadcasters. Let me just go back a second. Nixon claimed that liberal Jews dominated the media, which he felt was out to get him. And it was the press, particularly Washington Post journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who helped expose the Watergate scandal. Nixon's surrogates even mounted a campaign to yank the license of a television station owned by the Washington Post, which broke the Watergate scandal. After he resigned from the presidency, Nixon told interviewer David Frost that he gave the press a sword and they stuck it in, quote, "twisting it with relish," unquote. Ronald Reagan distrusted the press just as much as Nixon, but Reagan knew how to package his message. The former actor was able to work the camera, and he was so likable that reporters stopped covering his falsehoods because readers complained that the press was being mean to the Gipper. Throughout Bill Clinton's campaign and subsequent presidency, the media doggedly reported stories about his former business dealings and alleged sexual transgressions. And as his presidency progressed, his interactions with the media became more and more contentious, particularly as more scandals and controversies emerged. The media's relentless coverage of Clinton's affair with Monica Lewinsky and the ensuing investigations by independent counsel Ken Starr dominated the latter part of Clinton's presidency, and that created a major rift between him and the media. George W. Bush's relationship with the press was somewhat cordial during his first term, especially after the 9/11 attack. But as the Iraq War progressed and criticism of his administration mounted, Bush's relationship with the press became more strained. He was often defensive and had a difficult time handling media scrutiny, especially in relation to the war and his mishandling of Hurricane Katrina. His administration also faced allegations of manipulating intelligence to justify the invasion of Iraq, which led to further negative media coverage. Barack Obama was the first president to embrace social media, and he was generally less combative with the press compared to some earlier presidents. In Donald Trump's first term, his relationship with the press was highly adversarial, one of the most contentious in modern history. As you can see, they are evil people, the press and the media, bad people. Nobody lies like they do. From the beginning of his campaign in 2016, he frequently clashed with the media, calling outlets like CNN and the New York Times fake news, labeling the press the enemy of the people. Trump's often inflammatory rhetoric, combined with his dismissal of media criticism, created a hostile environment. His administration was marked by frequent confrontations during press briefings, particularly with those journalists who questioned him. In his first term as president, Trump pushed the Justice Department and the FBI to investigate journalists who published leaked information. Trump also had a strong social media presence, particularly on Twitter, and he used Twitter to bypass traditional media and to communicate directly with his followers. And like Nixon, Trump threatened the television licenses of stations that ran stories that he didn't like. When NBC reported on Trump's desire to increase the U.S.'s nuclear weapons stockpile, he reacted by saying the network should have its license revoked. In addition, he threatened to enact much stricter libel laws in response to critical coverage, which many worried would curtail the First Amendment. His verbal attacks on journalists laid the predicate for physical violence. At least 24 newspapermen were physically attacked in 2018, and all of them had been critical of the Trump administration. But as much as Trump claimed to despise the mainstream media, he often used it to further his agenda. Now, Joe Biden's relationship with the press was relatively more traditional compared to Trump's, but it was not without its challenges. Biden held press conferences infrequently, and his administration was criticized for a perceived lack of accessibility to the press and for limiting reporters' access, which led to some frustration among journalists. So, all of this is background before we turn to what we might expect with Trump's relationship with the press in his second term in office. So throughout his political career, Trump has had really a love-hate relationship with the press. That relationship was characterized by a mix of admiration at times and disdain and intense conflict with the media at other times. Trump reads the news, and he also watches cable TV news on a regular basis. He praises those outlets that support his agenda, such as Fox, those outlets that echo his worldview. He has even expressed affection for journalists who present his positions in a favorable light. On the other hand, he attacks those outlets, such as the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post, as biased. He says they are unfairly critical of him. He often refers to those venues as the lamestream press rather than the mainstream press. Fights between the White House and the media, as we have seen, is really nothing new in Washington. But Trump took it to another level when he branded reporters enemies of the people. And he accused them of propagating fake news, even when those news reports were fact-checked and supported by evidence, such as when he claimed his first inaugural crowd was larger than that of Obama's 4 years earlier, when the facts clearly showed that that was not the case. In Trump's first term, he particularly railed against the way the media covered the Charlottesville rally. He didn't like the way the media covered his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the investigations into the Russian interference in the 2016 election. But despite Trump's animosity towards certain newspapers and cable TV outlets, he has used the media strategically. He understands its power to reach audiences. His frequent interactions with the press, whether through rallies or interviews or tweets, that has kept him in the public eye, and it has served to rally his base. His media wars often acted as a tool to galvanize support, particularly among those who share his distrust of the mainstream press. And if Trump has a love-hate relationship with the media has a love-hate relationship with Trump. They often cover his every move. You may remember during Trump's first term, CNN was going to cover a speech he was going to make. But Trump arrived at the podium some 10 minutes late. And so for 10 minutes, viewers of CNN just saw the podium, waiting for Trump to come. And so that's an indication of how the media covered Trump's every move, amplifying his presence, and sometimes inadvertently boosting his campaign's visibility, even while the press was critical of him. So, what can we expect? Well, we don't know for certain what Trump's relationship with the press is going to be in his second term as president, but if history is any guide, it tells us that Trump is rarely satisfied with the news coverage he gets. He even complains about Fox News on a regular basis, despite the fact that that network overwhelmingly supports him. So Trump's reelection might lead to a renewed period of hostility with major media outlets that strive for impartiality, but who are accused of being biased against Trump. He might move to revoke licenses for TV stations, as he suggested more than a dozen times last year. He might limit press access to the White House, barring reporters that he doesn't like. So, in trying to figure out what Trump's relationship with the press is going to be like over the next 4 years, we might have a clue by turning to Project 2025, which was written by former and current Trump senior officials. Project 2025 offers a blueprint for Trump's policy concerning, among other things, the press over the next 4 years. The authors of Project 2025 believe that the media access to the administration is more of a privilege rather than a right. Those who drafted Project 2025 want to rein in the voice of America. Since the Cold War, the Voice of America have provided people around the world with accurate and timely news and information. Now, Voice of America is funded by Congress, but it also operates independently, which means it often reports critically on U.S. policies. And so Project 2025 recommends that Voice of America should come under greater control by the government. Project 2025 also calls for defunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which channels resources allocated by Congress to PBS and NPR stations around the country. Last April, Trump called for NPR funding to be rescinded, alleging, without providing evidence, that NPR, quote, is a liberal disinformation machine, unquote. Now, defunding public broadcasting would be disastrous, particularly for rural communities, which depend on radio and television stations funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The authors of Project 2025 also suggest that Trump's second administration should investigate whether journalists should even be granted space on the White House grounds. that could encourage an administration to grant access only to journalists who are favorable to the administration's agenda and not to those who would question administration policies. And that would render the president unaccountable to the public. So, taken as a whole, these recommendations contained in Project 2025 could harm democracy by restricting press access to Trump's administration and by defunding those venues that report critically on the president. Now, Trump insisted during the 2024 campaign that he had nothing to do with Project 2025. But as president, he proceeded to appoint some of the key architects of Project 2025 to serve in his second administration. On his first few days in office, he signed executive orders to implement much of what is contained in Project 2025 concerning immigration. In fact, nearly 2/3 of the executive orders that Trump has recently signed either mirror or partly mirror plans that were endorsed by Project 2025. And so it's not inconceivable to think that he will eventually implement the project's recommendations on press and the media. In fact, just the other day, Trump's FCC chair said, quote, "Congress is actively considering whether to stop requiring taxpayers to subsidize NPR and PBS." In other words, those very recommendations that are contained in Project 2025. Even before Trump took office for the second time, he launched a legal assault against journalists. During the past presidential campaign, Trump sued CBS News for the way it edited an interview with his opponent, Kamala Harris. ABC News chose to settle a defamation lawsuit brought by Trump over what he said was an inaccurate statement made by George Stephanopoulos. And ABC agreed to pay $15 million towards Trump's presidential library. Well, Stephanopoulos quoted a judge who said that Trump was convicted for rape, when in fact his conviction did not specifically state rape. It said sexual harassment. But Stephanopoulos was only quoting what the judge said. And many critics argue that ABC would have won the lawsuit had it not caved into Trump. And Trump has threatened to file a lawsuit against the Des Moines Register for publishing the results of a poll shortly before the election that suddenly had him trailing Harris. Many Republicans have adopted a much more negative view towards news organizations since Trump's first presidential campaign. 40% of Republicans and GOP-leaning independents now say that they have some or a lot of trust. In 2016, 70% of Republicans and GOP-leaning independents agreed with the statement, "Do you have some or a lot of trust in national news organizations?" But now only 40% of Republicans agree with that statement. Many of Trump's supporters believe the national news media has a left-wing bias and is therefore a big part of what ails America today. Republicans also are much less likely than Democrats to say that the news media did a good job in covering both the 2020 and 2024 elections. Journalists from multiple news organizations were denied credentials to Trump's election night watch event in retaliation for what Trump perceived as negative coverage of his campaign. In the wake of Trump's election victory, some of his loyalists assert that his victory represents a complete repudiation of the news media. Now, how has the media reacted to Trump's electoral victory? Well, journalism's job is to speak truth to power. even when it's dangerous. In fact, especially when it's dangerous. But some media executives began to try to curry favor with Trump even before he took office this month. Some of these media executives engaged in self-censoring in order to appease Trump. And so, after the Washington Post editorial board voted to endorse Kamala Harris for president, the owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, intervened. He declared that the paper would no longer endorse any presidential candidate. And that ended a decades-long tradition in the Washington Post. Now, critics saw Bezos's move as preemptive damage control in order to prevent any retaliation from Trump. Similarly, the Los Angeles Times refrained from endorsing a candidate in 2024, even though its editorial staff had endorsed Harris. And because the publisher of the Times decided not to endorse a candidate, that sparked resignations and reflected a broader trend of media outlets doing what it takes to avoid potential retribution. And one other example of the press and media caving into Trump, CNN announced that Jim Acosta, a Trump critic, would be switched from primetime to a middle of the night slot on CNN. And Jim Acosta announced the other day that he was leaving CNN because of that. So Trump's relationship with the press has been and is highly combative, marked by vitriol and occasional praise, depending on whether the coverage aligns with his agenda or not. His rhetoric towards the media, especially during his presidency, has been divisive. It's played a role in shaping the broader narrative of media distrust in American politics. Trump recently told Fox News that he believes it is vital to have a free, fair, and open media or press, and that he is not looking for retribution against his opponents. However, his new administration seems determined to build relationships with alternative forms of media, podcasts, the so-called nanosphere, while continuing to play hardball with those in the traditional press. In the first press briefing of Trump's second term this past Tuesday, just 2 days ago, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt deemed the traditional press as less and less relevant and showered extra attention on non-traditional media, especially sources on the political right, such as Breitbart News, who then praised her in return. So that completes my presentation on what we might expect from Trump and his relationship with the press. And that leaves some time to turn to some recent developments in the Middle East. And if you have any questions, please jot them down so that you can remember them when this presentation ends and we have time for questions and comments. So, President Trump will begin his second term with considerable leverage in the Middle East. And that is because the United States wields enormous influence in that part of the world. America has good relations with most of the major countries in the Middle East. It maintains a significant military presence there. It has provided economic aid and other forms of assistance to nations in the Middle East. The United States has a history of playing a central role in peace negotiations, dating back to the Camp David Accords from the Carter administration of the late 1970s. And so Israeli and key Arab leaders alike are very reluctant to offend President Trump. The current ceasefire deal, as I mentioned a few weeks ago, is very similar, if not identical, to an agreement that was on the table back in May an agreement fashioned by the Biden administration. But it wasn't until Trump was about to take office that the ceasefire deal was concluded. Trump sent his special envoy to speak to Netanyahu, and he put pressure on the Israeli government and on Hamas to agree to the terms of the ceasefire. But while Trump helped to push the ceasefire ahead, he also said that he was not confident that the agreement would hold. Now, Trump has particularly good relations with both Prime Minister Netanyahu and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. And Trump would very much like to normalize relationships between Israel and Saudi Arabia, the strongest allies of the United States in the Middle East. And so Trump said he would pressure Netanyahu to come to some kind of an agreement or rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. And if that were to come about, that would effectively isolate Iran. It would also increase American influence throughout the Middle East. But Saudi Arabia said it will not normalize relations with Israel as long as the war in Gaza continues and as long as Israel remains in Gaza. Until the war is finally over and the process of reconstruction has begun, the Saudis say, they will hold back from any reconciliation with Israel. And most importantly, the Saudis insist that it will not repair relations with Israel unless there is a pathway to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, that has put the Trump administration in a real bind. On the one hand, Trump very much wants a reconciliation between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And so you might think that he might support a process that might lead to Palestinian statehood. But on the other hand, Trump's appointees, such as his ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, and his nominee for representative to the UN, Elise Stefanik, they both openly question Palestinian rights to sovereignty. In fact, Mike Huckabee even questioned whether there was such a thing as the Palestinian people. And Trump recently suggested that Palestinians should be removed from Gaza and sent to Egypt and Jordan. And that certainly will not win favor with Saudi Arabia and will not lead to a Israeli-Saudi normalization. Well, either way, no matter how you look at it, Israel will be dependent on the Trump administration. Israel knows it must eventually end the war in Gaza and withdraw militarily. And Israel wants to weaken Iran's nuclear infrastructure to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And so Israel cannot produce either of these outcomes by itself. It might achieve both of those objectives, but only with active support from the Trump administration. So, what is going to happen in Gaza? Well, Israel doesn't want to be in a position where it has to face the following two undesirable choices. It doesn't want to be stuck in Gaza forever, in which case it will face an ongoing insurgency. It will be responsible for everything in Gaza, including reconstruction. On the other hand, withdrawing from Gaza would leave a vacuum, and Hamas could then stage a comeback. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is reluctant to withdraw from Gaza as long as Hamas remains in control politically. So there must be some alternative between these two unattractive options of staying in Gaza forever or withdrawing. What are those possible alternatives? Well, some have suggested a regional international administration that assumes responsibility for 1 to 2 years, during which time the Palestinian Authority can gradually assume control in Gaza. That would be part of phase 2 of the current ceasefire agreement. But those who recommend this 2 year interim period suggest that if the Palestinian Authority replaces Hamas in Gaza, it can't be the present Palestinian Authority, which has proven to be corrupt and inept. So the Palestinian Authority would have to be somehow reconstituted before it could gradually assume control in Gaza. Now, we spoke about a regional international administration. Egypt, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, and some European nations are prepared to set up and run a transitional administration in Gaza to take the place of Hamas, to restore law and order and begin the process of rehabilitation and reconstruction. But those partners would not engage in that unless Israel fully withdraws from Gaza. And because those countries, the Emirates, Egypt, Morocco, and European nations, they want to appear to be rescuing Palestinians and not providing any cover for Israel. And so they want the Palestinian Authority to play a major role in Gaza. And that's a scenario that Netanyahu has rejected in the past. The right-wing cabinet ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, would like to see the Palestinian Authority collapse entirely. But Netanyahu doesn't want that, because that would leave Israel with full responsibility for 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. So if the recent ceasefire agreement is successful, and if it is fully implemented, that opens the possibility of normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if that were to be accomplished, that would create an entirely new coalition in the region. The new government in Syria is exclusively focused on restoring stability there, on promoting internal development and reconstruction and modernization. So Syria is not overly concerned with Israel as it had been in the past. And any new Israeli-Saudi coalition might even help Syria to rebuild and modernize. Now, the issue of Iran is extremely important to the United States, to Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Those three countries want to weaken Iran. Now, economic sanctions have damaged Iran's economy, and the Israeli attack, the air attack this past October, exposed Iran's military vulnerability. It effectively knocked out Iran's air defense system. Now, just 6 months ago, Iran was able to use its proxies of Syria, Hezbollah, and Hamas to surround and threaten Israel. But today, those proxies are greatly weakened, or in the case of Syria, no longer exists. And Trump will certainly use Israel to threaten Iran to curtail its nuclear program. And so Iran is more vulnerable than ever. Iran can't really afford any further trouble. So it may agree to a deal to give up its nuclear program in return for an end to sanctions. But at this point, that seems unlikely, but it is a remote possibility. So let me finish by speculating on the future of what's going to happen for Israelis and Palestinians. Arab states who are interested in normalizing relations with Israel, such as Saudi Arabia, require that something has to be done for Palestinians. And as I said, Trump is determined to get Israel and Saudi Arabia to recognize each other. But the Saudis insist that Israel create some kind of pathway that would lead to a Palestinian state. Now, if Netanyahu were to agree to that, he will most certainly lose the right wing of his coalition. And that would leave him with two undesirable choices. He can either call for new elections, which might result in him being unseated from power, or he might try to form a coalition with more moderate parties. But to do so, he would have to commit to some kind of Palestinian state, which he has strenuously opposed in the past. So, what are the possibilities for Palestinians? Well, right now, a two-state solution seems more remote than ever, particularly after October 7th. That Hamas attack and Israel's retaliation has traumatized people on both sides. Neither side has been able to relate to the pain of the other. Both sides have lost the sense that any accommodation is even possible. And that renders the prospect of a two-state solution almost inconceivable. So, if the creation of an independent Palestinian state is no longer feasible, then only one state can emerge from the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But if Israel wants to remain a democratic Jewish state, a one-state solution is also untenable, even though it is promoted both on the Israeli right and on the Israeli left. On the political right, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir want to resettle Gaza. They want to annex the entire West Bank. They want to create one state in which Palestinians would not be citizens, but rather occupied subjects. And that would leave Israel, yes, a Jewish state, but not a democratic one, since a good portion of its population would not have equal rights. Now, on the political left, there's also a demand for one state, but a very different state than the one desired by right-wing Israelis. The left wants one state in which everyone in that state would be equal. But over time, Palestinians might very well outnumber Jews, and that would leave Israel a democratic state, but not necessarily a Jewish state. And the creation of one state comprised of Jews and Palestinians is really not sustainable because it ignores the fundamental reality that there are two national movements competing for the same space, with two national identities deeply rooted in the same territory. Neither side will give up their national identity, so if one state were to emerge, there would be forever conflict between Palestinians and Jews. And so, a one-state solution, in my view, is not viable. If accommodation is even possible, there needs to be responsibility and obligations on both sides. In my view, Israel must accept and tolerate a homeland for Palestinians on its borders. And any independent Palestinian state must be a responsible state, one that would not have independent militias, one that would not ally with Iran, one that would be committed to coexistence and give up the idea of resisting and eliminating Israel. So,